I didn't want to like Baldur's Gate 3. I put off playing it for months despite it ostensibly being right up my alley. I played and hated its predecessors, and I have an issue with its core concept as a video game version of Dungeons & Dragons. See, I love tabletop role-playing games. They're a pure distillation of two of my favorite things: storytelling, and a system of complex rules that can be utilized or exploited for strategic advantage. At the heart of every tabletop game, regardless of system, is an appreciation for creativity that I admire. I've played D&D in particular since the convoluted hellscape of 3.5, through the very tightly designed but unpopular 4th edition, and into the modern renaissance of 5e. I've written innumerable campaigns, rolled countless characters, and spent far more money on dice than a person should. And I've never played a single video game adaptation that did even a little justice to the concept of Dungeons & Dragons but virtual. After all, that basically means Dungeons & Dragons, but without the beating heart that makes it what it is. But I really like Baldur's Gate 3. I've always been dubious of attempts to translate tabletop experiences to video games. In my experience, the best RPGs take inspiration from the medium of their origin without trying to actually replicate it, and attempts at a pure transplant from one medium to another end up being shallow recreations with none of the appeal. Baldur's Gate 3 is the exception to that rule. Baldur's Gate 3 deserves to be analyzed for all the things it does well, not just for its unique place in a medium that can't fully support it. So this video is one of a pair. Here, I'll talk about the issues that are inherent to BG3's concept, and how it deals with and almost overcomes them. And in the next video, I'll take a look at the actual contents of the game, both the excellent and the handful of notable missteps. Baldur's Gate 3 is the third game in two completely separate trilogies. It continues the story of the Baldur's Gate series developed by BioWare that originally came out in 1998 and whose last mainline entry was in 2001, and it continues the legacy of Larian Studios' Divinity Original Sin duology that released in 2014 and 2017. Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 are well loved, but they really aren't for me. I hesitate to call them bad because they generally just come off to me as too average to disparage, and I know plenty of people hold them in high enough regard that I'm willing to believe there's something about them I just don't get. The Divinity Original Sin duology, on the other hand, is absolutely for me, but I hate them. Again, I don't want to call them bad, because they frustrate me in how disinterested I am in playing them despite supposedly being my type of game, and I have several friends who love them, so clearly they're doing something right. Baldur's Gate 3 is superficially very similar to the Divinity Original Sin games, utilizing a turn-based combat system taking place in open environments and using the same control scheme and camera movement to explore the world outside of combat. But while I find those systems tedious in Divinity, they're tolerable in BG3 because of all the massive improvements that have been made to every single other aspect of the game. There's a lot of things Baldur's Gate 3 does better than any other high-budget RPG ever made. Personally, I appreciate being able to make a character with hair that actually kinda looks like mine, because that never happens. And the fact that every companion defaults to pansexual, because that's just accurate to the genre in a way that most games are too cowardly to commit to. But BG3's crowning achievement is the characters. D&D, after all, came about because of the urge for a more character-focused experience, so it's proper for a game that seeks to emulate playing D&D to emphasize the individuals that populate the world. But that doesn't really do the game justice. It's clear that everyone who had a hand in writing and performing these characters poured their heart and soul into them, and the result is an extremely authentic experience. I have played a D&D character who was literally just Astarion. I have written NPCs into campaigns that were effectively different shades of Gale. I adore using the character archetype that Shadowheart embodies. Minsc and Boo have been stock characters in my world since I was first introduced to them as a concept, and while they aren't my bread and butter, I've played with people who love running variations of Karlach and Will. Hell, one of the first D&D characters I ever played was effectively just a gender-swapped Minthara in a different setting. But, instead of hearing myself or one of my friends poorly voice and improv their way through these characters, BG3 has the ability to rewrite bad lines and do additional takes before a player ever has to hear them, which adds up to a much more seamless verisimilitude than sitting around a table with 5 friends who accidentally speak in anachronisms and occasionally forget what their deity is named. But that's all BG3 can do. It doesn't matter how much planning and writing and encounter design the developers do, because it's ultimately a finite resource. Some of the best moments in D&D are completely spontaneous and unplanned. Some of the funniest combat encounters have come from bending or breaking the rules as written. The flexibility that comes from being able to react in real time is just unattainable for a video game, no matter how many hours the devs spend accounting for various decisions players can make. And that's where Baldur's Gate 3 really stumbles. The catharsis that comes from the end of a long-running campaign where beloved characters get their earned endings based on everything they've been through and old allies show up one final time is a hallmark of tabletop games, and BG3 tries to do something similar. Each character has a brief ending after the final boss fight that's based on the decisions you've made during the game, but because of that, they can't be woven together and come off as stilted. In my first playthrough, Astarion ran off because the sun was coming up, then Karlach immediately started burning up so she and Will went to Avernus, then it hard cut to a closing cutscene where the people of Baldur's Gate began to rebuild, then a quick talk with Shadowheart about the future, and that was it. It was anticlimactic and unsatisfying because it had to be. There couldn't be a fluid wrap-up that brings every character together and gives them each time to breathe, because the game has to account for every possible conclusion to each character's arc, and it simply isn't feasible to handcraft the ridiculous number of permutations that would result in. Speaking of the ending, Baldur's Gate 3 actually comes up against another current limit of the medium. I have a pretty powerful PC. It isn't top of the line, but it can easily run most games at max settings, and it handles all of my editing software with ease. In the footage I've been showing of the final hours of BG3, you may have noticed that the textures don't load properly and pop in during cutscenes. On top of that, the load times are pretty rough, and the game itself is a massive 130 gigs. I actually had to buy a new hard drive to store it and the additional 230 gigs of footage I recorded for this video. BG3 is massive, and current technology that's readily available to the average consumer just can't support it. The power of imagination, on the other hand, has no such halter. D&D is a very real experience when done well, and that's apparent in how it impacts the way players conceive the story. When I think about some of my favorite moments I've played, I don't remember my buddies sitting around a table eating pizza. I remember my dwarven fighter yelling bloody murder in a dark cave as he gets overrun by golems before being inadvertently blown up by a pyromaniac elf. While the voice acting and writing can make Baldur's Gate 3 feel more real than a typical tabletop experience, the constant reminders that you're sitting at a desk playing a video game do the exact opposite. Baldur's Gate 3 is an absolute achievement in game development. It's such an achievement that it pushes right up into the wall of what a game can currently do. Unfortunately, that wall is so often apparent while playing it. I do really like Baldur's Gate 3, and I think the praise it receives is very well deserved, but it also reaffirmed to me that attempting to translate certain things to the medium of video games is a losing battle. Ultimately, I came away from Baldur's Gate 3 disappointed that I didn't get everything I wanted out of it, but that disappointment only exists because for a second, Larian Studios made me think Baldur's Gate 3 might actually do the impossible.
I feel your breath upon my neck, a soft caress as cold as death. I didn't know you well back then, I blame it on luck and pain. Your blood like wine, I want it in. Oh darling, get me drunk and make me feel it's not my fault, I'm not to blame. These ain't my sins, I broke my chains. There's more to do and I still want to live.
I feel your breath upon my neck, a soft